typically have a definition of objectivity.
Yeah.
That something's objective if it's within the framework that the two political parties are debating. If it's not in that framework, it's biased. So,
exactly.
Concept of objectivity.
Yeah, exactly.
They could have it in the Soviet Union, you know.
Yeah, that's what I'm like. They think that.
Well, they are by that definition. They're objective. So, like if Republicans and Democrats agree, you have to agree. Otherwise, you're not objective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you cannot.
You're biased.
Present.
And
that.
If you're biased, you can't be a reporter.
Yeah. That's why I'm not working as a reporter right now. I was outcast from that profession.
Yeah.
But that's the part. Like so. Is there a way? And I don't think that. But that you cannot. I know you cannot be completely objective and fact driven and have all the evidence, because there's always evidence that you're not going to have.
You have to have a point of view. I mean, it's in physics too. You can't just look at an experiment and decide what the interpretation of it is.
Mm-hmm.
You have to approach it from a certain
lens,
framework of understanding, which could be the wrong framework. And it could turn out that our capacity for forming scientific theories is just skewed. The world doesn't work that way. I mean, for example, scientists automatically look for things like symmetry, simplicity, and so on. Maybe the world doesn't work that way. So they're always getting the wrong answers. And somebody from Mars could be laughing.
Yeah.
I mean, if we're organic creatures, we can't get out of our skins. We have certain ways of thinking about things.
Do you think there could be like mechanisms to approach that truth, or whatever that means?
Just work harder and try to
apply certain.
There aren't any real mechanisms, and this has been known for centuries. I mean, since you go back to the 17th century, there was still a belief that in what was called foundationalism, that you could start with sort of first principles and deduce everything.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, Descartes thought that he could deduce just about everything about the physical world, even the mental world, from what amounts to logic. That project collapsed. And since then, nobody's seriously tried to resurrect it.
Okay. And this has to do with what I have been talking about, but it also relates to what is happening all over the world, about people's motivations to pursue their self-interest and organize and build, like mobilize and build a better society. Do you?
No, but it's not all random. It's not that everything goes. There's a common human nature, and I think you can kind of learn over time. We've learned more about it. So the world's pretty ugly, but there are many things that were just taken for granted as perfectly normal not long ago, totally uncontroversial, which now are considered unspeakable, like slavery. It takes time. It wasn't an easy victory. In fact, it took most of human history to overcome it.
A little bit now, we still have kind of slavery,
yeah. So, like now, there's incarceration, say prison labor. It's a kind of slavery, and so are sweatshops. So it's there, but it's not considered. You go back a century or 2 centuries,
where it was
just the way the world ought to be. In fact, there are people who are born to be slaves. They're not happy unless they're slaves. I mean, there were even medical researchers who argued that Africans have bent backs because they're genetically designed to pick cotton. If you don't let them do it, they're unhappy. These things, nobody could write that down. Maybe somebody could be outlandish. And it doesn't have to go back that far. I mean, take You go to the Harvard Medical School, there are portraits on the walls of famous physicians and surgeons, including people who invented, say, modern gynecology. And the way they did it was by experimenting on black and Irish women. They were considered tools for experimentation. You couldn't get your picture up on the wall of a medical school for doing that now.
Well, or in Guatemala in the 40s where they...
Yeah, that's a perfect example. And that was considered perfectly fine. Actually, they were doing it right here in Boston with children at a school, Fresnel School, the school for, they call it mentally disabled or whatever, but they were doing experiments with them. In fact, same with animal experimentation. Things that were done 30, 40 years ago just can't, are illegal now.
Yeah.
Are women's rights. No, it's just changed. Conceptions have changed. And I think it's pretty much in the same direction. It's not like that it moves around randomly, which I presume means that there is some inner moral code which we're gradually exploring and learning more about.
So you do think we have, well, that sort of morality that...
I think so. In fact, there's even evidence about it. It almost has to be true. I mean, you couldn't make moral judgments if it weren't true. And people in many areas make pretty consistent moral judgments. Not at all. And in fact, if you really look back at these issues, they weren't so simple. So take slavery. I mean, now we don't argue about it in principle. But if you go back the early 19th century, the slave owners actually had arguments. And they were arguments that were never answered. Pretty good arguments, in fact. So, for example, if you buy a car and I rent the same car, and we come back a year later, your car is likely to be in better shape than mine because you own it, so you're going to take care of it. I rent it, so I don't care, I'm going to discard it. Well, the same logic applies to owning and renting people. If you own people, like slavery, you take care of them, they're your property. If you rent people like a northern manufacturer, wage labor, you have no responsibility for them. So the slave owners argued that they're more humane than the
wage labor.
Than the north. It was not an inconsiderable argument. It was never answered. The reason is there's no answer to it. Like wage labor is also a kind of slavery.
Both of them have different moral...
Well, you look into the argument, you learn something. I mean, you don't learn that slavery is right. You learn that wage labor is wrong.
Yeah.
But that meant that the slave owners ought to be allowed to present their argument. And the argument wasn't answered, really. It was answered by northern workers who agreed that wage labor was wrong, but not by northern industrialists. So, that's... these things are often like that.
So you think they're tapping that morality that people have, maybe they can get mobilized to...
I think they can explore
organize
systems. I mean, if you and I have a different moral judgment on something, whatever it is, say bombing Libya, doesn't mean we just have to scream at each other.
Yeah.
And you can explore it. Maybe come to some common ground. I mean, that's if you're reasonable.
If I'm reasonable.
Yeah.
Which...
That sometimes it doesn't work.
Yeah. Okay.
I just came back from Belgium, which is splitting apart into Dutch and French. And they just hate each other. They don't want to talk about it. If it was a third world, it'd be a massacre.
Do you, with what is happening now, coming to current events like what happened in Egypt and Tunisia and what is happening in Wisconsin, do you think is it because, well, I guess it is because people are going for their survival and self-interest, and that moves them a little?
More than that, I mean, in Wisconsin and in Egypt and Tunisia, the protesters, the uprisings there, Yeah, maybe there's some self-interest involved, but a lot of them are just dedicated to general human rights and freedom. I mean, the protesters in Wisconsin, there's tens of thousands of people in the streets. Most of them are not subject to collective bargaining principles.
So there's a principle of solidarity that they're...
Principle of solidarity with people fighting for their rights. Like you and me, we don't gain anything if people demonstrate in Tahrir Square, but we still support it. And in fact, a rather dramatic moment in the last month or so was when one of the major labor leaders in Egypt sent a message of solidarity from workers of Egypt to workers in Wisconsin. Yeah, that's what the labor movement was built on, international solidarity. And I think that's a real human drive. Hidden often, maybe beaten down, but it's there somewhere.
And that solidarity, could it also come from just the vision that if better human society or better world to live in than what we have right now?
So people fight for that. Spend a lot of time, struggle hard for it. It's a constant. That's what Rousseau has some very eloquent passages about, which I can't repeat, about how Europeans should learn from primitive people, because these are people who are struggling courageously for elementary human rights, which they surpass Europeans who are sort of luxuriating in wealth and so on, not fighting for anything.
Selfish.
Yeah, they put it rather well.
Yeah. Yeah. So, well, I was going to ask you, now that I mentioned before the 140 anniversary of the Paris Commune, and it ties into this idea of I guess solidarity and movements, and how why do you, and I guess my question is what do you think in essence is the motivation of people to join these movements? And in the case of the Paris Commune, why do you think it failed?
It was crushed.
Because of that.
Didn't
kind
fail.
Of like Libya's getting crushed.
Yeah, might be. Or the Spanish anarchist revolution was just crushed. I mean, there were internal failings, but it's not what destroyed it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, right nearby. Take, say, Nicaragua in the 80s. There was a lot wrong with the Sandinistas, but could have been overcome. What was right about what they were doing was just crushed by force. And I remember I was there enough that in the early 80s, Nicaragua was just full of hope and excitement. The early 90s, it's one of the most hopeless places I ever saw. So bad. I had a daughter living down there, but my wife and I just couldn't face going down. It was such a crushed society. And you could see it just in people's simple actions. Like in the early 80s, when there was still a spirit of solidarity, hope, we can achieve things, people were really doing things. By the early night, my daughter lives still lives in a kind of what we would call deep poverty by their standards, or middle class, like a stone floor.
In Managua?
In Managua, electricity a couple hours a day, that sort of thing, wasn't horrible. And nearer there were hideous slums, but there happened to be a playground near her house, where kids would go out and play, and it had playground equipment in it, like sliding board and things, and it had all rusted and fallen apart and so on. Half the men in the neighborhood were, welders or something.
And they
wouldn't go out. They were drunk. They wouldn't go out and fix the sliding board so their kids could play.
What do you think? And in that moment, it was still